Just me. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Xin. Really appreciate it, your time and your effort. Welcome to the show. For those who are first time here, today I have invited Mr. Xin Tao. Mr. Tao is a partner at Baker McKenzie, and he's also the leader, chair of U.S. Healthcare and Life Science Regulatory Practice. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure.
Why? I know you are the one of the experts on U.S. FDA regulations. Can you share a little bit about your background and particularly in terms of recent FDA announcement about this new clinical trial involving sending Americans' living cells to China for genetic engineering and subsequent infusion back into U.S. patients, and what are some views you can share with us?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do it, Brian. First, let me introduce myself. As Brian mentioned, I'm a partner in the DC office of Baker McKenzie. We're a global law firm with over 6,000 lawyers and over 75 offices across the world. And I'm based in Washington, DC. And for my personal background, I was a scientist before I practiced law. So it really helped me have conversations with scientists and lawyers, because when I was scientist, I can add the legal perspective, and when I'm with lawyers, I can add the scientific perspective. And you mentioned this, Brian, you mentioned this announcement from FDA really surprises a lot of people. I think, people say, hey, this is maybe this shouldn't be surprising because we know the executive order 14117, which, by the way, was under President Biden, and then there was the DOJ, Department of Justice regulations that took effect actually April 8th this year, that implement the data restrictions. So what that does essentially, if you are transferring bulk sensitive human data from US to China, there are restrictions, but there are exemptions. For example, if you're using the data for clinical trials, which is finally intended for regulatory approval purpose, there are exemptions. So FDA announced last week with this announcement. The announcement, it sounds, it's halting the new clinical trials while FDA is conducting a review. But the scope is actually quite limited. It's just for living cells transferred from US to China for genetic engineering. Now, if you think of the potential implications, it's really for like things like CAR T cells, when we know we need to get cells from the patients, and then sometimes we need to do the genetic modification to it and then inject back to the patients. And there are just not that many we're aware of currently transferring living cells from US to China for many reasons. One, the transportation with these living cells can be quite a logistical challenge. And there are actually quite a few facilities here in the United States that can do this very efficiently. So we don't know actually how many clinical trials are being conducted this way. And secondly, while the FDA referenced the EO 14117 and the DOJ data security programs, I want to point out that FDA does not have the legal power or jurisdiction to enforce that law. That law is for DOJ, the Department of Justice, to enforce only. It has criminal powers as part of that programs. People who are in violation can be criminally charged, but FDA has no power to enforce the DOJ regulations. If you read that announcement closely, I think what FDA is implying here is they don't think the DOJ regulations are comprehensive enough, and the exemption might be too broad, and therefore they're doing a review. And there is really not much details on what's FDA's legal basis for halting these clinical trials, but it does imply that part of the justification might be FDA's want to make sure everything's transparent and patient got proper consent, which informed consent, which is always a part of the requirements for clinical trials. So that tells me part of the justification for halting these trials might be the patients may not be informed about the transfer. So therefore, FDA may want the sponsors to look into this further and provide the proper consent. But in either case, FDA should not have no power to enforce the DOJ regulations on data security programs.
Thank you, Xin. Very informative. I'm glad you help us shed a light on this very timely and important issue. I just want to follow up on several points you raised during the past the talk. What if you mentioned that the scope is limited? Are we looking really about the CAR T cells, and what are some areas potentially got to be impacted? Is that only for cell therapy, or is also for gene and gene editing therapy? And secondly, you mentioned the EO, the executive order. Also about this Biden administration's exemptions. Can you be more specific? Because you mentioned this is only for the regulatory purposes. Now the loophole is being, eliminated. Are there anything we should be paying attention to?
Yeah. So first of all, on the science. So the announcement is, it's a very short news announcement. I think everyone should read it in full. And I think the scope is really for living cells transferred out of US to China for genetic engineering, right? There's no mentioning of what this is for. Is it CAR T? Is it gene therapies? There's no mentioning of, what are the potential applications. Now, in addition to EO 14117, there's another EO that is mentioned or referenced in the FDA announcement. That EO concerns, I don't have the numbers from me, but that EO concerns banning federal funded research that transfers cells from US to China for genetic engineering. So, I think to the extent any clinical trials, it doesn't matter, it's gene therapy or cell therapy, if there are living cells being transferred from US to China for genetic engineering, that might be covered by this announcement. Now, if you read this carefully, this is really the scope. But I think when people don't read this that carefully, or people are concerned, are there other things? Hey, it's a borderline issue, right? It's not clear cut. Are these cells considered living cells, or is this something we do like with vectors should be considered as genetic engineering, for example, genome editing? I think when you go into the gray areas, what this announcement does is actually really put a lot of uncertainties on your operations. And therefore, if everything being equal, right? If you have to do this, you have the preference, you have the choice of doing this in China or another country, I think will absolutely push people to consider the alternatives here, just given, the potential scrutiny from FDA. Now, this is really separate from the DOJ's data security programs, which again, the two agencies have two different, powers in terms of doing these reviews. FDA, I think part of justification, as I mentioned, is really the patient consent. They have no power to enforce the DOJ's regulations on data. Now, back to the DOJ regulations on data, Brian, you mentioned. So, I think it's really subject to different people's opinion. In my best opinion, I don't think it's really a loophole. It's really the exemptions that when this proposal came out, there were comments from the industry, right? A lot of people submitted comments from the industry. I think people recognize that you have to give the exemption for these clinical trials. Now, this EO 14117 is really based on national security concerns, and life science is really part of it. It concerns, data you are collecting from US, for example, government employees, personal data that can potentially be used, in ways damaging US national security. But the exemptions provided on the healthcare, on the clinical trials, I think it's a notion that these data, one, their justification, their right purpose, a public policy purpose to collect these data, and there shouldn't be any the national security concerns doesn't justify the prohibition or restrictions on the use of these data. So, in my biased opinion, again, I represent the life science industry. I don't think these are loopholes. I do think these are justified exemptions. Now, if you look at exemptions, I think there are, I don't want to go into too much details, but I think there is enforcement grace period right now from April 8 to July 8, which is 3 months. So in these 3 months, DOJ will not actually criminal charge anyone if there are good faith efforts. But after July 8th, which is about 2 weeks from today, if there are any violations, there could be criminal charges against violators. I think only through these enforcement actions, we will be able to tell the boundary of these exemptions. Now, DOJ in their guidance has said they will interpret these exemptions very narrowly. We don't know what that means, right? How narrow. I think we can only tell through the actual enforcement cases. And I fully expect there will be enforcement cases because for every new regulations or new laws from a federal agency, if you want people to take it seriously, if you want people to understand law, you have to start enforcing. So I think starting from July 8th, when the grace periods, limited enforcement periods ends, we're going to see probably some enforcement actions. And I think at that point will be more clearly what the exemptions means from DOJ. But again, this is a DOJ enforcement. This is a DOJ program. FDA's enforcement is separate from the DOJ, and FDA has no power to enforce the DOJ regulations.
Xin, I want to just follow up on this. What are some immediate implications? You mentioned this living cells and the scope right now, and also you mentioned that the exemptions out there. What do you see? Some immediate, like people will get concerned about like folks like clinical trials, service providers, or cell therapy developers, or even something like currently marketed cell therapy in the U.S. Are this going to be impacted, or should the folks get concerned about?
Yeah, so certainly, this is certainly something that I think when you're reading the news, right, everyone are concerned because some of the news articles, if they're not careful, it reads like everything is banned between US and China when you're transferring these living cells, but it is not the case. If you read this FDA announcement, I think, again, it's just a news announcement, right? But it just says they are going to do immediate reviews on the new clinical trials, right? It doesn't say anything about clinical trials that is ongoing. It just says new clinical trials. It doesn't say anything about products in the marketplace. It says new clinical trials. So my interpretation, again, I don't want to also overly interpret. This is something really tied to the concerns the agency has regarding national security. And that really comes from I think the concerns if you have these genetic materials, living cells transferred to China, somehow the data will be collected from these living cells, for example, the genome data or the omic data, and that's really their fundamental concern here. And for the FDA, I mean, again, they don't have the power to enforce the DOJ regulations, but they do mention that they think if you do this, you have to provide consent to the patients. Now, I don't think the FDA announcement says it's a ban. You can't do this. I think what FDA announcement says that they're aware of this practice. They want to do an additional review of this practice. It doesn't mean that after this review, everything involving transferring living cells from US to China for genetic engineering will be stopped, right? Because it's unclear at this point. They can't enforce the DOJ regulations. So what's the basis for stopping these trials? Part of the justification is the patient consent. But after you gave the proper consent to patients, if the patient knows, okay, my cells are transferring from US to China for genetic engineering, and that's the reason because they have this special technique only can be applied in China. And if they consent to it, I mean, does FDA have the power to still stop the trials? I don't know the answer to that question. So I think if looking at the details, I think it's quite limiting, and it doesn't actually sound that bad. They're just doing reviews. It's not like they're stopping everything, right? Um, but I do agree that, there will be a chilling effects, right?
Mm.
This is something we have experienced last year with Biosecure Act, right? The Biosecure Act actually targeting those listed companies, um, also have the mechanisms of having additional companies added to the list that essentially you can't have these companies in your supply chain if you're doing business with the federal government. There were lots of interpretations. There were a lot of discussions on exemptions on how this will not apply to other companies in China. But still, we see the chilling effects in the marketplace. People are certainly, they have additional provisions, for example, in their contracts, service contracts, structured in a way that if somehow the company is listed, there will be rights to terminate, there will be rights to renegotiate, and the payment will be structured in milestones to minimize exposures. So I think given these actions, I think it's a trend. We're seeing a trend, Brian, here, not just these two announcements. In addition to the FDA clinical trial reviews, there's also the Commissioner's National Priority Review Voucher, which was also announced last week, I believe, during bio. And in that, among the four criteria, one criteria is regarding national security. It says that your drug could be qualified if you are domestically manufactured here in the US and can help with national security, right? This is rarely used in the language of any FDA regulations or guidance in the past. But we are seeing this trend of national security as a key term working into a lot of these policies, not just the DOJ, but also FDA. This is something I think which is relatively new and subject to interpretations. But I do think this will not stop. I think this trend will likely continue, and this will likely have a chilling effect on how you do business going forward.
Thank you, Xin. I do want to bring it back to how enforceable is this new review mechanism, and what it be look like in the as it's going forward. Will it be get challenged by potential suits in the court, or it's gonna be something we should be looking out for?
Right. I think the first question really, we're going to see, I think, very quickly, which clinical trials are going to get impacted, right? I think, the number could be quite limiting because for myself, I'm not aware of a lot of clinical trials going on between US and China involving transfer living cells for genetic engineering. So let's see how many trials are actually impacted. And secondly, if you want to challenge this legally, from administrative law perspective, you need a final action from the agency, and you need to have their basis for that rejection. I think the review itself is just a process FDA can certainly apply to these clinical trial reviews. They have the power to do this. But if they stop the clinical trials simply on the basis that, okay, this involves a national security concern, and therefore you cannot continue, even if you give all the consents, if you comply all the FDA regulations, you still cannot continue. I do think at that time there's a basis for engagement with the agency to understand what's the power FDA has to stop a clinical trial based on national security. What's the legal basis for that? Is there any particular regulations on point for FDA to rely on to stop a clinical trial based on national security concerns? I think that point there is a chance for engagement with between the industry and FDA. I think it's too early to say whether this is something that will really has the wide implications from the review. Maybe it's a review process FDA has, but it will just slow down the review. But eventually, if you meet all the applicable FDA requirements, you can still do it. Then I don't think this is something that will be something that really interfere with the current operations. But if this is something that FDA reviews, you comply with all the applicable FDA regulations, including the patient consents, you still cannot do it, then I think certainly there is the discussion, because FDA cannot and should not enforce a DOJ regulation on data restriction. That should be left for the DOJ to decide. FDA's power is only with their own regulations and laws.
Okay, let me just dive a little bit deeper into this national security priority review voucher. Uh, from obviously still early in the early stage, we were waiting for more details emerging. What are some things you would be paying attention to when this is be implemented? It would be something more like more favor the domestic the new drug developers over the countries from the countries adversary countries on the list, or something that is more up out of the national security concern.
Yeah, I think national security concern is being used in a lot of things. I think it really starts with the trade. There is currently a Section 232 trade investigations on pharmaceutical supply chains
Mm.
uh, based on national security. The rationale being a lot of these APIs are manufactured in foreign countries outside of the United States. So they want to understand this is actually done by Department of Commerce. They want to understand, hey, are there national security concerns given how the supply chain is structured? And if there are, there could be additional tariffs. There will be maybe quotas for importation. The rationale being they really want to encourage domestic manufacturing. Now, there are a lot of executive orders issued since January this year. I think the overall objective is certainly American first. The country's policies, we want to increase domestic manufacturing here in the United States, including drugs. And for drugs, if you look at FDA's policy, I think there are announcement recently. FDA is going to expand unannounced foreign inspection programs. I think FDA is also instructed by EO executive orders to provide reliefs for domestic companies to open up drug manufacturing sites. So certainly there is this trend, I think, consistent with the trade policy of like having this manufacturing onshoring here in the United States. And the rationale being that this is for national security. And national security is really a strong term to use because it can covers a lot of things. And it can be very hard to legally challenge something that is based on national security. I do think, as I said, this trend will likely continue. I think it's just a bit surprising to see this works into the FDA regulations and policies because historically, FDA's legal basis for regulating drug is, it has to be safe, it has to be effective, right? And that's really the two main things FDA look at when they review drug applications. I think, just starting from some recent policies on foreign inspections, on these clinical trial reviews, on this Commissioner's National Drug Priority Voucher, the new program, you can see national security terms referencing all these policies. And I think that's a trend that we're likely to see in the next few years, at least, on the drug regulations.
Xin, I want to just make it very plain. Do you think this is going to end the China originated deals? It's not going to be altogether, but at least impact a majority of them.
Um, I'll be optimistic, right? I don't think that's the national security actually impacts the current licensing deals. I think you think about the transaction, the cross-border collaboration transactions. I think licensing deals remains the most popular options between collaborations, among US and China, and not US, but the entire like global pharma industry with China. Because the licensing deals only involves asset, right? And when you have the asset transferred, that's really the easiest and cleanest way of doing collaborations given the geopolitical concern. Um, in comparison to other collaborations, for example, you form a joint venture, or you have some kind of from a new company like a NewCo. The China side has a minority share in this new company. You have investors. Being a shareholder, you have the management team as a shareholder. Then you form a new company here in the United States. I think for those collaborations and partnerships, geopolitical could be a concern, but for licensing deals, one simply involves asset transfer. I think that's actually a lesser concern. Geopolitical is a lesser concern because it's an asset deal. Um, I do think that, when you think about looking forward, right? I mean, we have all these geopolitical tensions, the trade being one, all these DOJ programs, Department of Justice programs, the FDA programs. But at the same time, we have explosion of activities in the transaction side, right, Brian? We have all these MNCs, multinational corporations, shopping around in China. I think it's just very interesting to see that, hey, the deal is not slowing down, but we have all these geopolitical driven policies and tensions here. What I would say is, I do think that, for me, I mean, it's still a biased opinion. I'm born and raised in China. I work in the States, right? I think the patient, disease has no boundaries, and collaboration should have no boundaries. Um, I think for all the policies, we certainly should open our eyes, right? We should not just pretend they don't exist. We should analyze them. We should really assess them. And when you analyze them and assess them, you will really understand, hey, there are risks. There are things we need to pay attention to, and maybe that requires some tweaks in the language of the deals, in the structure of the deals. But I don't think that, the asset transfers essentially from China to US, the model of having China's innovative asset being acquired by the capitals, by the global capitals, will necessarily stop, even in light of these policies. I do think changes are actually being made, the whole time since the Biosecure Act from last year. We do see a lot of collaborations. For example, if nowadays, if we want to have a dispute probation being if you have a dispute over the contract terms, you need to litigate this case in somewhere. Nowadays, we usually recommend Singapore or London as a neutral forum, not US or China, right? We do see that a lot of these deals are structured in a way companies want to do more due diligence on the company, especially involves partnerships. They want to understand who their China partner is, and they want to understand which party they are doing the transaction with. Is that a US subsidiary? Is it China parent? I mean, all these things, actually, the market has a way to react to these policies. And I do think we will certainly make changes to these policies in the future. But overall, I don't see this is stopping anytime soon, Brian. I think this is, yeah.
Right. Speaking of changes, you also mentioned the NewCo, as we just touched upon model is going to actually slow down or actually fading away slowly. Why did see this trend is actually not going to be there, I mean, for the time in the near future? What are some reasoning behind the slowing down or even disappearing of this NewCo model?
Right, right. Now, I wanted to caveat here. I'm not saying it's slowing down or disappearing. I'm saying that people are certainly giving a refreshed look at the new code they're doing. I think new code is something that invented or we'll say rediscovered just recently because of the policy changes we have, especially the uncertainties in the trade, in the geopolitical. There are a lot of Chinese companies, they have great assets, but sometimes they could not get a partner from MNC, and therefore they want to work maybe with an investor. They have the fundings, they have the team to push the asset, which is usually very early to a later stage, mid to later stage. And then therefore they could seek IPOs in the US or have a partnership at that time with MNC. So I think that's the rationale for NewCo really helping, bring the partnerships between experienced U.S. investors, U.S. teams with the China's asset, China's R&D power. And then we're hoping that this could really bring all the team together and then push this forward to MNC. I think a few things changed over the past few months. I mean, starting really January, first of all, we have seen that the MNCs are warming up to the Chinese assets. I think in the past that when you talk about, hey, this is a company from China, we have these great innovative drugs. I think sometimes people think, hey, we need to really look at the data very carefully. There's no track record on company. Now I think the formula is different because a lot of MNCs have done these big deals in China, and they have somehow validated some of the data they have seen in China. And Chinese assets, I think by and large, actually are quite hot in the marketplace today than 6 months ago. Just given the track record, there are a lot of deals being done. And I think there is this so-called peer pressure among MNCs. If other companies are doing deals in China to getting these assets, and you are not, I think you felt left behind and you got pressures from investors. Um, and then secondly, I do think that if you look at NewCos, I mean, there are some NewCos who are done very successfully, right? By investors, they got these assets from Chinese companies, and then after a few months, even they were able to sell it to MNCs at much a higher price. And I think this got some Chinese companies thinking, hey, am I missing out? Why am I not selling this directly, right? What happens during these 6 months that I could not do myself? Maybe I should just use the money which I have obtained through these licensing deals, right? These licensing deals involves quite some upfront payment, which can be invested into their own R&D. Now I have these deals done, I have this money. Why don't I do it myself and push this forward? And therefore I can get, that money directly from MNCs, right? So I think there are, and also I want to add, right now there's a very hot Hong Kong IPO market. And although there are just a few companies being listed, but every IPO will release a lot of money from investors, from VCs, which can be reinvested in the China biotech space, which then can help push forward these drugs to a later stage, which will raise more interest from the MNCs. I think if your ultimate goal is to sell to MNCs, right? I mean, a lot of companies are really thinking, why can't I do it myself now? If funding is not that urgent a need, given all these market condition changes, if the MNCs are more willing to talk to me, right? Because given the track record of the Chinese asset, so maybe, hey, you want to think twice about doing a NewCo, and also doing a NewCo, you're only going to be a passive investor with a minority equity shares, right? What does that mean when you're thinking about market returns in the future? If you have an IPO or if you have licensing deals, how much you're really going to get? I think these are all questions people are actually thinking about. I'm not saying this is going to be gone, like disappear forever. I think it's just a something that people rediscovered at that time, I think about a year ago, and really popular, a lot of discussions about 6 months ago. But now, given the market condition changes, I think licensing suddenly sounds more attractive to a lot of people.
Got you. Xin, this is a very fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. I understand that you mentioned this it's not because of new core is not is fading or is disappearing, but because of the involvement of the participants, particularly Chinese biotech companies are getting mature. They're looking more into licensing deals, and they have other venues, not because of they are the new code model is not popular anymore. So great for that. Just have a last minute or two, just to wrap up. What are some in the next summer? We are looking at this. How do you assess as a takeaway from our conversation? What's something you're really looking at right now, and for the next 2 or 3 months can play out, and folks out there should pay close attention to?
Yeah, I think so. Like let's backward to 6 months ago at JP Morgan, right? I think a lot of people are thinking, hey, we have deregulations with this new administration, right? There will be hopefully quicker approved timelines for new drugs, right? There will be some stabilities with the geopolitical tensions, maybe. But I think the market proves, I think a lot of these thinking were wrong, and I'm willing to admit, right? I was being, on the side of being overly optimistic at that time. We're really hoping there will be a great peak of transactions and collaborations between across borders, right? Regardless of US, China or EU, China. But that I don't think that really happened or materialized. There is certainly still quite a bit of activities. I think if you look at overall deal volumes, it's is considered to be flat. I do think there are a lot of money right now. The MNCs has a lot of money, a lot of cash sitting. They do have the need to refill their pipelines. I do think there will be a lot more licensing deals in the near future. I don't think any of these national security policies, regulations will necessarily stop the trend or reverse the trend. But I do think we need to watch this closely because I think we're living in a world that the policy changes can really happen very quickly, and that requires us to adapt to the condition very quickly. I'll give you an example. The one thing we haven't covered, this is not just U.S. China, it's most favored nation drug pricing. This is something that the administration proposed that drug price in the U.S. should be based on the lowest numbers in a relatively developed country. The developed country, I think the criteria is defined as some country with GDP per capita 60% of the US, which includes about over 20 countries in mostly European countries, but also includes Japan and Korea. What that means is the drug price in US, if this policy or law, whatever you call it, will become effective, then the drug price in the US has to be the lowest among these 28 countries. That means if you have a partner in Japan that is launching a drug at price A, in the US, you have to drop your price to price A to match it. So we're seeing that actually the changes our clients are thinking right now. So if they're doing a deal, right, they want to have the global rights outside of China if they are buying into these Chinese assets than just the US rights. Because for the worst case scenarios, if this most favored nation policy becomes effective, then I can't just have the US rights. It's too risky, right? If someone launched the drug in Korea or Japan, it will impact me. So therefore, I really want to have the global licensing rights outside of China, or at least the US rights plus those OECD countries' rights. So this is change I'm saying right now, even before the law become effective. So I think all these things we discussed today, the living cell clinical trials, the DOJ data security programs, the national priority review vouchers, we're going to see changes in these discussions, these transactions. And I think eventually, I think people will agree on, how do we factor this into these transactions? And national security being a big concern, I think people do want to be more careful, when they're thinking these deals. I mean, I don't think we will stop, but I think it's just going to be more changes to the deal structure, based on the structured payment, more due diligence. So I do think it's very important these days, more than ever, to focus on these changes and take advantage of them too, right? I mean, I think this can be a great negotiation point to add if this favors you, if this policy change favors you, and you want to defend yourself, right? If this point is being brought to the negotiating tables, you want to defend yourself, and how do you frame the impact? How do you frame the implications? I think it's very important. So I think it's more important than ever to focus on regulations and DC policies.
Thank you, Xin. I'm so glad you brought, up the MFN, this very important topic, and I'm so glad you having some time with us and share your very insightful opinions. And I hope I'll be able to talk to you soon. Thank you, Xin, again.
My pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.